try and cram it all in. Thank you for having us, Catherine. Thank you for everyone for coming along, and for the Internet Institute for having us. One of the key aims of Transcribe Bentham was to assess whether or not untrained amateur volunteers could transcribe or were capable of carrying out tasks traditionally associated with trained researchers. In our case, it's the transcription of 17th and 18th century manuscript material and the encoding of this material in text encoding initiative compliant XML. We're glad to say that 2.5 years later, after launching, our volunteers have more than risen to the challenge of this. What you're seeing here are a few examples of some of Bentham's more unpleasant manuscripts to transcribe, shall we say. They're complicated variously by deletions, interlineal additions, marginal notes and asterisks notes, which then disappear on other parts of the page. Not to mention his frequently awful handwriting and his dense and challenging ideas. What all these manuscripts have in common is that they've all been transcribed by amateur volunteers to a very high standard, with a little bit of quality control on our part. I've not got the very unpleasant one. So what I thought I would do today is briefly describe the purposes of Transcribe Bentham, why the project was launched, and some of our results so far, and then I'll concentrate on two main aspects of the project: the level of quality control which we have to administer to the submissions, and the impact of the work of Transcribe Bentham on the Bentham Project as a whole and what we do, and by extension the potential impact on similar editorial projects. Firstly, a bit of background about Bentham. He's perhaps best known for two things. First, the proposed panopticon prison, designed by his brother Samuel. This was based on a central inspection tower with the cells around the outside, so the prisoners were subjected to what they would assume to be perpetual surveillance. And what Jeremy called this simple idea in architecture, he thought this would permanently cure the deviancy of criminals and be equally applicable for supervision in places like factories, schools and lunatic asylums. Secondly, Bentham requested that his remains be, I quote now, would be put together in such a manner as that the whole figure may be seated in a chair usually occupied by me when living in the attitude in which I am sitting when engaged in thought. So after being publicly dissected, Bentham's auto-icon was put together and now lives at UCL. Lives is probably the wrong word to use, but you know what I mean. I've had the very dubious honour of having to carry this thing down the corridor on a couple of occasions, and there's not a lot of weight in it. That wasn't in the job description. Corpse removal. However, both the panopticon and the auto-icon tend to obscure Bentham's enduring importance in quite a wide range of fields. His thoughts and ideas have had a profound historical impact, and they're still of contemporary significance. Bentham was the founder of the modern doctrine of utilitarianism, that the right and proper end of all legislation should be the promotion of the greatest happiness. His so-called philosophic calculus was the inspiration for cost-benefit analysis. He laid out a systematic theory of punishment which emphasised deterrence, reformation of the individual, and proportionality of punishment. His Nonsense Upon Stilts is an important critique of the doctrine of natural rights, the forerunner of human rights theory, and he was a theorist of representative democracy, and this is just a summary of his interests and what he wrote upon. Unfortunately, those wanting to access Bentham's work face quite a substantial obstacle. The edition of Bentham's works, published between 1838 and 1843 by his literary executor John Bowring, is not really useful for modern scholarship. It omits several works published in Bentham's lifetime, particularly those concerning religion and sexual morality, which are due to be published later this year by the Bentham Project. Nor does this edition include many substantial works which Bentham didn't publish but do exist in manuscript form, and the edition also includes translations into English of what are called simplified French versions of Bentham's works by another of his disciples, Etienne Dumont. So there's the issue of how much of these works are actually Bentham how much are the translator, and how much of them are Dumont. Finally, it's really densely typeset, and the biography of Bentham written by Bowring has been described as one of the worst biographies in the English language. So it's not great. An attempt to rectify this deficiency began with the foundation of the Bentham Project in 1959 at UCL, and for the past 50 years it's been producing the new critical edition of the collected works of Jeremy Bentham. These are based on both Bentham's published works and his unpublished manuscripts, and it's been really quite a Sisyphean task. UCL's Bentham papers run to about 60,000 manuscript folios, about 30 million words, a rough estimate, while the British Library holds another 12,500 folios, or another 6 million words. To date, 29 of a proposed 70 volumes of the new edition have been published, and about 20,000 manuscript folios have been transcribed. Or this is prior to the launch of Transcribe Bentham, I should say. So the majority of the Bentham papers, which is a resource of great historical and philosophical importance, remain untranscribed and their contents largely unknown, save for a very rough outline index, and most of the new edition is yet to be published. And as a result, our understanding of Bentham's thought is at best provisional and at worst a caricature. Excuse me. Which is where Transcribe Bentham, we hope, comes in. It seeks to recruit volunteers willing and able to transcribe Bentham manuscripts, which will then serve a dual purpose. Firstly, the transcripts, which are of a sufficient quality, are uploaded to UCL's free-to-access digital repository for access, searching and long-term preservation. And second, Transcribe Bentham allows volunteers to make a contribution to humanities research. Their transcripts will act as a starting point for future volumes of the collected works, and volunteers will be fully credited for in any volumes to which they have contributed. And furthermore, since many of these manuscripts haven't been even read since Bentham wrote them, there's the potential to make some quite interesting new discoveries, which I'll talk a little bit about at the end. Briefly, some of our results. As of the 15th of March, that says the 8th of March, but it's the 15th of March, we had 2,454 registered users, 5,243 manuscripts, or about 2.6 million words, have been transcribed, and of these transcripts, 4,975, or 94%, have reached the required standard, which we need. Since the project began, an average of 40 manuscripts have been worked on each week, about 20,000 words, although since the 1st of January 2012, the transcription rate is 45 transcripts a week, about 22,000 words. By any measure, this is a huge amount of work, and it's more than a full-time member of staff could be expected to do if they dedicated their time to transcription. Like many other crowdsourcing projects, we've found that most of the work is done by a minority of people. Only 362 of the registered users, so about 15% of all registered users, have actually done any work. And of those who did transcribe something, almost 2/3 only worked on one manuscript and then disappeared and didn't come back. And in fact, the great majority of the work has been carried out by these individuals. There are 15 super transcribers. The ones in blue are the ones who are still participating at the moment. And the work of these volunteers really does sustain the project, and they are greatly valued by us for the amount of work they do. Two volunteers, Diane Folan and Jay Fox, have both transcribed over 1,200 manuscripts each, and Lee Stern is closing in on her 1,000th manuscript as we speak. Yes, so that's that. A major concern about crowdsourced transcription is, of course, whether it's actually worth the effort. And with many transcripts coming in each week, this is quite a real concern for us. So it's whether the money and effort invested in developing a platform, managing the volunteers, recruiting the community, and then checking that their work is of a sufficient standard, would this money and time not be better off invested just employing experts to do the job instead? We have quite demanding quality controls necessarily because of the nature of the material at hand and eventually what it's going to be used for. And the moderation of submitted transcripts really is one of the key tasks in Transcribe Bentham, and one of our most time-consuming tasks. Transcripts which will be used in a volume of the collected works will be ultimately worked on by at least 4 people, so at least 1 volunteer transcriber, 1 Transcribe Bentham editor, the volumes editor, and the collected works general editor. The transcripts uploaded to the digital repository will be worked on by at least 2 people, at least 1 volunteer transcriber and 1 of the Transcribe Bentham moderators. So after a transcript is submitted, we check it for textual accuracy and encoding consistency, and the key question is to whether there will be any appreciable improvements likely to be made through further crowdsourcing, and whether the transcript forms a viable basis for access and editorial work. If we approve it, then we lock the transcript so there are no further edits that can be made to it, but the rendered transcript remains available for viewing and searching. If the transcript is regarded as incomplete, if there's a lot of gaps, if paragraphs haven't been transcribed, then it remains available for further crowdsourcing. And this is unavoidably subjective. Though it's unavoidably subjective, I think this process does ensure that the locked transcripts provide a reasonably accurate idea of the contents of each manuscript. In a 2012 article in Literary and Linguistic Computing, I always have trouble with that, we concluded that though Transcribe Bentham's early results were encouraging, checking submitted transcripts and managing the website proved extremely time-consuming, and anyone who's read that paper might get the impression that our idea about the success, we were rather ambivalent about the potential success of Transcribe Bentham. This article focused on a funded 6-month testing period between the 8th of September 2010 and the 8th of March 2011. We noted that the then 2 full-time research associates on the project each spent the equivalent of a month's full-time work on checking submissions. Had the money spent on Transcribe Bentham instead employed us to transcribe manuscripts on a full-time basis, we concluded that we could have transcribed about 5,000 manuscripts between us over 12 months, or 2.5 times as many as the volunteers would have produced had they continued transcribing at the same rate. And based on these findings, David Weinberger was perhaps correct to suggest that for now, the results of the Bentham Project cannot be encouraging for those looking for a pragmatic way to generate high-quality transcriptions rapidly. Although admittedly this scenario is hypothetical because no funding body would give us money just to transcribe manuscripts. However, this finding is now quite out of date, as our recent results paint a much rosier picture, thankfully. Between the 9th of March 2011 and the 1st of October last year, Transcribe Bentham was then operating with very minimal funding provided by UCL, essentially 2 days a week of my time to run the project. And only 1 day per week was actually spent on checking submissions. And despite this reduced staffing level, the transcription rate actually increased. We were getting an average of 42 transcripts a week during this later period, as opposed to 35 transcripts a week during the testing period, or the equivalent of 2,184 transcripts a year, as opposed to 1,800 a year. And had I devoted my 2 Transcribe Bentham days to transcribing stuff myself, then I could have done between 870 and about 1,050 transcripts a year. So not only were manuscripts being transcribed faster by volunteers during this later period, but the quality control process had been made more efficient. These findings are, however, only estimates, and under our current funding from the Mellon Foundation, from the 1st of October last year, we're now measuring the quality control process in much more detail by recording several metrics detailed here. The most important of these ones are the time spent checking the transcripts and the number of changes required to be made to the text and the markup before we can accept it as being complete. From the 1st of October 2012 to the 22nd of February this year, 639 transcripts were submitted by 25 individuals. They collectively transcribed 212,000 words, not including markup, or an average of 332 words per transcript, again not including the markup. It's about 300,000 words if you do include the XML markup in the total, or an average of 470 words per transcript. And that the markup increases the number of words that the volunteers have to transcribe by about 30%, is clear evidence that if we were to eliminate this from the work of volunteers, then they might be able to transcribe more text, which is really the key aim of the project. Was it gone? There we go. We spent the equivalent of, or during this period I should say, we spent the equivalent of 63 hours and 14 minutes, or about 8 days worth of labour checking all the transcripts coming through, plus another 77 minutes correcting any errors in the XML after we converted the transcripts to XML files. On average, it takes just about 6 minutes to moderate a transcript, though this varies depending upon the length and complexity of the manuscript, the experience of the transcriber, and the consistency of the markup. Just by way of example, this manuscript is composed of about 95 words. It took a mere 52 seconds to check. The handwriting is legible, there's very little in the way of complication to it, and no changes were required to either the text or the markup. This one, on the other hand, was a bit more problematic. This took me over half an hour to check, and 35 changes were made to both the text and the markup. The transcript itself, I should say, was superb, but it was 1,200 words long, and though the writing is fairly legible, there's the problem of having to identify where the marginal notes should go in relation to the text, and there's numerous deletions and additions and nested tags, which I won't go into, but are very unpleasant. After converting the transcript to the XML, it then took another 15 minutes to find a mistyped line break tag, mistyped by me, I hasten to add, but it's that kind of mundane task which slows us down a bit. And that a transcript can be checked in about 6 minutes is extremely encouraging. It takes much longer to transcribe one of these things from scratch. Anywhere between 20 minutes to over an hour. Something like that would take about an hour to transcribe, and even then it wouldn't be perfect. However, the process can be streamlined even further, given that over half the time spent checking a transcript is spent checking the markup. If we at the moment we are embarking upon a number of improvements to the transcription interface. The key one, which we think is the key one, is the introduction of a what you see is what you get transcription interface as an alternative. So the XML is under the hood, and the volunteers don't necessarily have to bother themselves with it. They can just concentrate on transcribing. And we hope that that will make things easier for them, and it will also make things easier for us, because the XML will be consistent, and we won't have to iron out so many inconsistencies. And feedback from volunteers has shown that the markup has been a real discouragement to participation. I'll briefly spin on to the impact of Transcribe Bentham on the work of the Bentham Project. The Bentham Project has had a commitment to open access to its resources for a number of years. We share transcripts of material upon request, and the Journal of Bentham Studies has been an open source publication since 1997. We have a clear interest in the success of Transcribe Bentham, both for its raising the profile of Bentham studies and the benefit of ongoing transcription and engagement with the material. Having diplomatic transcripts of all manuscripts for a particular volume of the collected works could, depending on how many transcripts we're talking about, if there's a couple of thousand, then it could save between 6 months and a year's worth of an editor's time when producing a volume, and make our applications for grants for editorial work much more competitive. And Transcribe Bentham, I hope, also demonstrates the fruits of a partnership between volunteers and scholars. So just to give you an idea of how valuable this is to us, as I mentioned earlier, the Bentham collection at UCL consists of 60,000 manuscript folios, and the BL has another 12,500 folios. And without getting into a technical discussion of how many are folia and how many are bifolia, we estimate that it will require about 100,000 transcripts to complete the whole collection. Between 1959 and 2010, about 28,000 transcripts were produced by the Bentham Project staff on an ad hoc basis when volumes of the collected works were being produced. So there's no ongoing transcription going on in the background. This is an average of about 549 per year, and at this rate it would take 131 years to transcribe the remainder of the collection. And the production of the collected works would take even longer than that. Between the 8th of September 2010 and the 15th of March this year, Transcribe Bentham volunteers produced 5,243 transcripts, or an average of 2,080 per year. And at this rate, the remainder of the collection would be completely transcribed by 2045. So at least I would be alive to see it happen. Still very, well, still slow, as all relative I suppose, but compared to the previous scenario, this is really lightning fast. If the proposed improvements are implemented tomorrow on the transcription interface, we're hopeful that the transcription rate could be increased to about 100 transcripts a week, given that it would make the task easier, more people would be inclined to have a go. In this hypothetical scenario, that's about 5,200 transcripts a year, and at that rate the remainder of the collection would be complete in 12 years' time, which would be fantastic if we got anywhere near that. So although there are significant costs associated with digitising the material, creating the transcription platform, and even taking into account the level of staffing required to check submissions on an ongoing basis, and maintaining the website and storage, should the rest of the collection be transcribed by volunteers, we've estimated that the Bentham Project could avoid costs of just under £1 million by today's costings. And the benefit to the researcher community of making available the material and involving the public in creating such a resource is incalculable. And the potential impact of crowdsourcing on our work thus is enormous. Just to round off, a further advantage of Transcribe Bentham is that volunteers are continuing to raise the profile of Bentham's thought by making interesting discoveries amongst the collection. Most recently, volunteers have uncovered a series of manuscripts relating to Bentham's Panopticon, in which he goes into fearsomely minute detail, including the design for a chair which he came up with to... he designed it for the comfort of heavily pregnant women. Something which he called, it's very unfortunately named, called the pedotrophium, which is what Bentham envisaged as a foundling hospital attached to the Panopticon, and even this series of cooking tips and recipes for the Panopticon prison's kitchen. These recipes include something called Devonshire pie, which includes layers of onions, tripe and gooseberries, which sounds delicious, neatsfoot soup, and this baked apple pudding, which I had a go at making a couple of weeks ago. It's not pretty. But I'm told after having tested it out with my colleagues that it didn't taste as bad as it looked. So, small mercies. We are, hopefully later in the year, we're going to produce a little Panopticon cookbook to promote Transcribe Bentham and this sort of thing. And if you Google for "bake it like Bentham," you can see the whole horror in all its glory. More seriously, volunteers have also transcribed manuscripts shedding further light on Bentham's view about animals. Owing to this partial quotation, Bentham is regarded as sort of a proto-animal welfare activist. Doesn't quite capture his position, but one volunteer, Diane Folan, has identified one particular recollection from Bentham's childhood, which, though it was mentioned in the Bowring edition of Bentham's works, we had no idea where it came from until she transcribed this manuscript. And Bentham recalled how, at the age of 5, and I quote now, "I took it into my head to amuse myself with putting earwigs in the candle. I had no malice to the earwigs, poor insects, for my disgust at them, if I had conceived any, would have led me rather to have avoided them than to have handled them in the matter. But the writhings of their bodies, added to the little explosions made by the moisture of their juices, composed a scene which amused my curiosity." One of the family's servants then noticed what Jeremy was up to, and asked me what I thought the earwigs must suffer for, and what I could have to say for myself if anyone that was stronger than I should were to serve me in the same manner. I was struck with remorse. I looked back upon the deed with horror, and from that time I have been nearly as attentive to the feelings of the brute part of the creation as of the human. So this could well signify the Bentham's Damascene conversion to the treatment of animals. This quotation, I should say, doesn't capture Bentham's position fully at all. The fuller quotation makes it clear that Bentham wasn't against the infliction of pain upon animals per se, but the infliction of useless cruelty. So killing animals for food, perfectly acceptable. Because he, as he said, they have none of those long protracted anticipations of future misery that we humans have. So make of that what you will. Elsewhere, also of potential importance is a third unpublished section of Bentham's 1802 work, Panopticon versus New South Wales, which was a passionate condemnation of the practice of transporting convicts to Australia. Bentham volunteers have discovered this section. It runs to some 200 pages, but it was never published. And although Panopticon versus New South Wales is extremely prominent in the literature of convict transportation, no one has ever mentioned this particular section. And given that I am a historian of convict transportation and colonial Australia, I am very interested in piecing this back together. Just to finally round off, that the Bentham papers, which I would suggest are some of the least user-friendly manuscripts out there, that we can successfully crowdsource these, I think does suggest there's a lot of potential for crowdsourced transcription, despite the initial outlay required and ongoing costs in keeping a project going, although as more and more there's a proliferation of transcription tools at the moment. So as these become adopted, then hopefully the cost of starting one of these projects will be reduced. Though we only have a few regulars currently participating, we do have to respond to their needs, and we're currently trying to do this at the moment. There's also the question of whether what we are doing with Transcribe Bentham is crowdsourcing at all. Though it's open to all to participate and there's this mass open call, we're quite happy for anybody to have a go. There is an element of self-selection in that not many people will have the combination of time, skills, inclination and indeed patience to have a go at transcribing Bentham. And my colleague Melissa Terrace at UCL has described Transcribe Bentham's crowd sifting, which seems to me a more accurate description. For example, this is a Tasmanian conduct record from the Archive Office of Tasmania, and I've worked in great depth with these. If we could develop some way to ask volunteers to transcribe each of these elements in this, an army of family historians and genealogists would be able to tell us, would be able to work on these with little problem. If we could get these transcribed in a systematic manner, add references to individual convicts, we could create this immensely powerful resource for convict history, and we'd be able to know how many convicts were in a certain place on a certain day, how many convicts were punished in a certain manner over a certain period, so much more. The key thing is these manuscripts have been digitised, but there's no metadata associated with them, there's no way of searching them, and to all intents and purposes they are as unsearchable and as inaccessible as if they hadn't been digitised. Which brings me very, very finally to Transcriptorium, a new European Community FP7 funded project which we're involved in. It aims to open up vast swathes of digitised manuscripts to researchers, students and the general public. It's led by the Universitat Politécnica de Valencia in Spain, and it aims to develop solutions for handwritten text recognition software and the automated transcription of handwritten manuscripts, so essentially OCR for manuscripts. Our task is to develop with the University of London Computer Centre and run a platform based on the Transcribe Bentham transcription desk for crowdsourcing HTR correction, so the results can then be fed back to the software and its results in the future will be more accurate. And it promises to be very exciting. So, as Bentham wrote in 1793 in another manuscript discovered by a volunteer, many hands make light work, many hands together make merry work, and Transcribe Bentham is, we hope, an example of the truth of this maxim. So thank you very much for putting it.
Okay, if Tim doesn't mind, I'm going to ask that we go out for coffee, otherwise we won't get time to drink coffee, and I think we all need some to carry on this discussion. So if we go and have coffee now and come back just after 4 o'clock, and we'll